Bong smiled behind his oxygen mask. This was exactly why he and Lynch had volunteered for this mission. They were the Flying Circus, an experiment authorized by General George Kenney himself. Take the two highest-scoring American aces in the theater, give them their own P-38s, and turn them loose on targets too far for the regular squadrons to reach. It was controversial. The regular squadrons needed every P-38 they could get, and here were two birds being used as private ace-maker machines. But Kenney believed the propaganda value outweighed the cost. America needed heroes. Bong and Lynch would be those heroes. The arrangement worked because Bong and Lynch trusted each other completely. Lynch was 8 years older than Bong, a seasoned professional who'd been one of the first P-38 pilots in the Pacific. He was aggressive, tactically disciplined, and absolutely reliable. When Lynch covered your tail, you didn't need to look back. Bong was quieter, more reserved, but equally skilled. His gunnery was phenomenal. He could hit targets other pilots couldn't even see. And he had an intuitive understanding of energy management that made him nearly impossible to catch in a fight. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts. Take the bomber, Lynch said. He was senior, so he got first shot. You cover. Got it. They pushed their throttles forward. The P-38Js, the latest model, could dive steeper and faster than earlier Lightnings. Bong and Lynch used that performance, now rolling inverted and pulling into a near-vertical dive. The Japanese bomber, a Kawasaki Ki-48 Lily, was just lifting off the runway gear, retracting maybe 1,000 feet up. The pilot never saw the two P-38s screaming down from above. Lynch opened fire at 300 yards. The 450 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon converged on the bomber's right wing. Metal disintegrated. The wing folded. The Lily rolled right and fell, smashing into the jungle in a ball of orange flame. Lynch's kill, his 18th. But he only got it because Bong was there covering his tail, watching for the Japanese fighters that might have tried to bounce them during the attack. That's how they flew. Every mission, every fight. Two ship elements built on absolute trust. The next day they came back, and the day after that. Sometimes they found targets. Sometimes the sky was empty, but they always flew together, and they always watched each other's backs. By February 15th, Lynch had 18 kills. Bong had 22. Neither man would have survived alone. Major Gerald Johnson felt good, rested, sharp. Had spent the last few weeks at Nodzab on rest leave. His squadron commander George Walker had basically ordered him to take time off. Now he was back with the 49th Fighter Group, leading a 4-ship element of P-38s over Ormoc Bay. Below, U.S. Navy warships maneuvered in the blue water. American and Japanese convoys were both trying to supply their troops on Leyte, and the fighting had reached a fever pitch. Johnson's job was simple: keep Japanese aircraft away from the Navy ships. It was 9:50 in the morning when the bombers appeared. Bandits, Johnson called. 2 o'clock low, I count. 9 bombers. 3 fighters as escort. The Japanese formation was perhaps 3,000 feet below the P-38s. Twin-engine bombers, probably Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers, in a loose V formation. Above them, 3 Ki-43 Oscars weaved back and forth, watching for interceptors. Johnson didn't hesitate. We take the fighters first. Stay together. On my mark, break. The 4 P-38s rolled into a dive, descending on the Japanese formation like hawks on sparrows. The Oscar pilots saw them coming and turned to meet the threat. It was brave. It was also exactly what Johnson wanted. The Americans had altitude and speed. The Japanese had maneuverability. In a turning dogfight, the Oscars would have the advantage. Johnson had no intention of dogfighting. His first pass came from above and behind one of the Oscars. The Japanese pilot focused on positioning himself for a defensive weave. Never saw Johnson until the P-38's guns opened fire. Pieces flew off the Oscar. Smoke poured from the engine. The fighter rolled over and fell toward the sea. Johnson didn't watch it crash. He was already pulling up into a zoom climb, trading his excess speed for altitude. 1,000 feet. 2,000. 3,000. Below him, the other two Oscars were trying to engage the remaining P-38s, but Johnson's wingmen weren't cooperating. They'd learned the same lessons Johnson had: slash through, extend, zoom, climb, attack again. Never turn with a more maneuverable opponent. Johnson rolled inverted at the top of his zoom climb and came back down. The two remaining Oscars were below him now, still trying to engage. Johnson picked one, lined it up, and fired. The Oscar exploded. 2 quick bursts. 1 pass. Both Oscars down in flames. Count 'em, Johnson called over the radio, unable to hide his satisfaction. 1, 2, 3. 45 seconds. 3 Japanese fighters destroyed. Let's get those bombers, Johnson said. The 4 P-38s went after the bombers together. No individual glory hunting. No breaking formation to chase personal scores. They worked as a team, taking turns making firing passes while the others covered. By the time they were done, 4 of the 9 bombers were falling toward the sea in flames. Johnson returned to base with 4 confirmed kills. That brought his total to 23, making him the 3rd-ranking ace in the theater. But he didn't think of it that way. He thought about his wingmen who'd stayed in position throughout the fight. He thought about the bomber crews his flight had saved. He thought about the squadron, the team. Individual scores were just numbers. What mattered was that the team succeeded. That afternoon, Major Tommy McGuire led a patrol over the same area. McGuire was the 2nd-ranking ace in the theater, with 31 kills, and he was absolutely obsessive about formation integrity. His flight encountered more Japanese aircraft, a mixed formation of fighters and kamikaze attackers heading for the American ships. McGuire shot down an Oscar. His wingmen got 2 more kamikazes. Another flight joined the battle and got 2 more. It was textbook teamwork, coordinated attacks, mutual support. No one broke formation. No one went chasing individual glory. And then Dick Bong violated the rules. Bong was flying as element leader in McGuire's flight that day. As they positioned for another attack, Bong spotted a lone Japanese bomber, a Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally, running along some clouds. Without calling it out, without telling anyone what he was doing, without waiting for McGuire's orders, Bong broke formation and went after it. He caught the Sally, shot it down, and returned to the formation as if nothing had happened. McGuire and his wingman were furious. Bong had violated the most basic rule of air combat in the Southwest Pacific: teamwork. Had abandoned his formation. Had failed to communicate. Had gone off hunting alone. This wasn't a minor mistake. This was the kind of breach that got Americans killed. Teamwork, the integrity of the formations, and fighting together had been drilled into every pilot coming into the SWPA since 1943, one historian later wrote. It was the hallmark of McGuire's tactical manual. When they landed at Dulag, McGuire confronted Bong. The details of what was said aren't recorded, but witnesses reported that both McGuire and his wingman seethed over Bong's behavior. For McGuire, the ace race didn't matter. Personal scores didn't matter. What mattered was the system, the team, that kept pilots alive and won battles. Bong was the top ace in the theater. He had more kills than anyone. But on that day, Head failed the most important test. Head abandoned his team. It wouldn't be the last time teamwork, or the lack of it, would determine life and death in the Pacific skies. January 7, 1945, Negros Island, Philippines. Major Tommy McGuire, led a 4-ship element through the morning sky at 2,000 feet. They were hunting, looking for Japanese aircraft staging through the airfield at Fabrica. McGuire had 38 confirmed kills. He was 2 behind Dick Bong Ha, just been sent home. If McGuire could get 3 more victories on this mission, he'd tie the American record. 4 and he'd become the ace of aces. But McGuire wasn't thinking about records. He was thinking about the mission, about his wingmen, about getting everyone home, alive. Behind him flew Captain Edwin Weaver, his number 2, then Lieutenant Douglas Throp, and Major Jack Rittmeyer, making up the second element. At 10:15, Rittmeyer's voice crackled over the radio. "I'm having engine trouble." McGuire kept his voice calm. "Okay, Throp, take the element and close it up." Throp advanced his throttles and moved forward, taking over as element leader. Rittmeyer stayed in position, his crippled P-38 falling slightly behind. They were still adjusting positions when Weaver spotted the enemy. 12 o'clock low. Coming straight at us. It wasn't a 0. Intelligence would later identify it as a Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar, flown by Sergeant Akira Sugimoto. But in that moment, the distinction didn't matter. What mattered was the geometry. Sugimoto was 1,000 feet ahead, converging head-on. Combined closing speed 520 feet per second. That gave them 2 seconds to react. 2 seconds wasn't enough time to do anything properly. Not enough time to drop external fuel tanks. Not enough time to accelerate to fighting speed. Not enough time to position for a proper attack. McGuire horsed his P-38 into a tight left turn. Weaver stayed with him. Both pilots still had their external tanks attached, nearly 2,000 pounds of extra weight under each wing. That weight radically changed the P-38's handling characteristics, making it slower, less responsive, and prone to stalling in tight turns. As they turned, Throp had to make a split-second decision. He could turn into the Oscar and take a head-on shot, or he could break left and draw the Japanese fighter away from McGuire, allowing his commander to get into position for a killing shot. Throp chose teamwork. He broke left and started to climb. Sugimoto took the bait. He rolled right, stood his Oscar on its wing, and bent around after Throp. The Japanese pilot closed quickly. The Ki-43 could outturn a P-38 even without the weight of external tanks. Throp was running full throttle now. He glanced in his rearview mirror and saw the Oscar right behind him, gun muzzles flashing. Where was McGuire? He should have rolled out of his left turn by now and gotten behind the Oscar. That was the plan. That was how the tactics worked. But McGuire and Weaver remained in a tight left bank, unable to complete their turn with the weight of the external tanks. Then Throp heard McGuire's voice, "Daddy Flight, keep your tanks." Throp did as he was ordered. But now he was in serious trouble. The Oscar was right on his tail, guns firing. Major Jack Rittmeyer saved Throp's life. Despite his engine problems, Rittmeyer saw the threat. He came in from behind and to the left of Sugimoto's Oscar and opened fire. A rain of bullets struck the Japanese fighter. Sugimoto pulled off Throp's tail and whipped around. He saw Rittmeyer pass him and went straight after Captain Weaver instead. "Heads on me now," Weaver called. The Oscar cut inside the American's turn easily. At 200 feet altitude, Weaver couldn't dive away. McGuire was his only chance. McGuire tucked the yoke tighter, trying to pull the P-38 around to get a shot. The nose shuddered. The aircraft was right at the edge of a stall, that point where the wings lose lift and the plane falls out of the sky. Then the P-38 snap-rolled. The nose dropped. McGuire ended up inverted for a split second. Then his fighter plunged straight into the ground and exploded. Major Tommy McGuire, 38 victories, second highest scoring American ace, author of the tactical manual that had saved hundreds of lives, was dead at 33 years old. The cause was simple: he'd violated his own rules. Keep your tanks was a fatal order. With nearly 2,000 pounds of extra weight, his P-38 couldn't maneuver. When he tried to turn tight enough to save Weaver, the aircraft stalled and snap-rolled. McGuire died trying to save his wingman. It was the ultimate expression of the teamwork doctrine Head preached. But the tactical error, keeping the external tanks on, had doomed him. Sugimoto meanwhile limped away from the fight. Rittmeyer's bullets had riddled his Oscar with holes. He crash-landed a few miles away and was caught at the crash site by Filipino guerrillas. They executed him on the spot. His body was later found with 6 bullet wounds. Head fought alone. Head died alone. But Head also taken one of America's greatest aces with him. December 27, 1942. Buna, New Guinea. Let's return to the beginning. To the moment when American and Japanese tactical philosophies first collided in force. Tom Lynch's flight cruised at 23,000 feet, higher than most fighter pilots typically patrolled. Lynch was obsessive about altitude. Altitude equals energy, Head, tell the new pilots. Energy equals speed. Speed equals life. At 12:05 p.m. they made contact. Below them, spread across several miles of sky, was the largest Japanese formation Lynch had ever seen. 40-plus aircraft. Maybe 50. Val dive bombers at 4,000 feet. Zeros and Oscars stacked in layers up to 13,000 feet. Lynch's flight had 4 P-38s. The Japanese had at least 40 aircraft. Normal tactics said don't engage. You're outnumbered 10-1. Call for help and wait for reinforcements. Lynch attacked anyway. Not because he was reckless, not because he was seeking glory, but because he understood the mathematics. The Japanese formation was layered but not coordinated. Different units, Army and Navy, flying together for one of the first times in the war. The Zeros and Oscars weren't accustomed to working together. They'd be operating as individuals, each pilot looking for targets. Lynch's 4 P-38s, on the other hand, would fight as a single coordinated unit. Drop tanks, Lynch ordered. Stay together. We go through them fast, extend, zoom, climb back up. Do not, repeat, do not, get into a turning fight. The 4 P-38s rolled into their attack. Lynch led. Dick Bong flew as his wingman, covering Lynch's tail. Behind them, the second element held position, ready to cover the first element or exploit any openings. They hit the Japanese formation at 400 miles per hour. Lynch's guns found a Zero. Pieces flew off. The Zero rolled away smoking. Lynch didn't watch it die. He was already looking for the next threat, already evaluating his energy state, already planning his escape route. Bong covered him. When 2 Oscars tried to turn onto Lynch's tail, Bong was there, guns blazing, forcing them to break off their attack. The P-38s blew through the Japanese formation in seconds. Then, instead of turning back to fight, they dove away, building even more speed, and zoom climbed back to altitude. The Japanese pilots, expecting a dogfight, found themselves facing opponents who refused to dogfight. The P-38s would slash through, climb away, and come back for another pass before the Japanese could reposition. It was frustrating. It was demoralizing. And it was devastatingly effective. By the time the battle ended, the Americans claimed multiple kills. More importantly, Lynch's 4-ship element was intact. Everyone went home. The Japanese lost aircraft and, more critically, lost experienced pilots who couldn't be replaced. This was the mathematics that determined the outcome of the Pacific Air War. Individual Japanese pilots might be more skilled. Individual Japanese fighters might be more maneuverable. But the American system, teamwork, mutual support, coordinated tactics, meant that American squadrons were more effective than the sum of their individual pilots. And in war, effectiveness is all that matters. The clash between Japanese and American fighter tactics represented more than just different approaches to combat. It represented two fundamentally different philosophies about warfare, honor, and the individual's place in society. Japanese fighter pilots were trained in the samurai tradition. The word samurai itself means to serve, but the philosophy emphasized individual excellence, personal honor, and martial skill. A samurai was a warrior artist, someone who perfected their craft through years of dedicated training. This translated directly to air combat doctrine. Japanese pilots were taught to rely on superior individual skill. The best pilot, the most skilled, the most aggressive, the most committed, would prevail. Formation flying was loose and flexible, allowing each pilot to exploit opportunities as they arose. At Namonhan in 1939, this approach worked brilliantly. Japanese pilots racked up enormous scores against Soviet pilots who were operating under rigid, inflexible formations. When the Soviets flew in tight formations that couldn't react quickly, individual Japanese pilots could exploit gaps and weaknesses. The lesson Japanese pilots learned from Namonhan: individual skill and aggression win fights. But Namonhan taught the wrong lesson. The Soviets lost at Namonhan not because team tactics don't work, but because they were using bad team tactics. Their formations were too rigid, too inflexible, and didn't allow for mutual support. The Americans, when they arrived in the Pacific, made the same mistakes initially. Early American formations were rigid and inflexible. Pilots were taught to follow their formation leaders and maintain position no matter what. And they died. But the Americans learned. They adapted. By late 1942 and into 1943, American tactics had evolved into something new, something that combined the flexibility of individual initiative with the strength of team coordination. American pilots flew in pairs and four-ship elements. Each pilot was responsible for his wingman, and each wingman was responsible for his element leader. The formations were flexible enough to react to threats, but coordinated enough to provide mutual support. It was the perfect synthesis of individual skill and team strength. The Japanese never made that synthesis. They continued to emphasize individual skill and aggressive maneuvering. When they encountered American formations that refused to break apart, they were baffled. Why wouldn't the Americans fight properly? Why did they always extend away instead of engaging and turning dogfights? Where was the honor in slash and zoom tactics? They didn't understand that the Americans had a different definition of honor. For American pilots, honor meant bringing your wingman home. Honor meant completing the mission. Honor meant protecting the bombers, or the ships, or the ground troops you were assigned to cover. Individual glory was nice. But it was optional. Mission success was mandatory. By late 1943, the statistical evidence was overwhelming. The 24th Sentai, one of the most elite fighter units in the Japanese Army Air Force, had been effectively destroyed. After the August 2, 1943 battle, the unit pulled back to refit. Some replacement pilots arrived, but they lacked the experience of the veterans they were replacing. The 24th would fight on through 1944, but it never recovered its pre-war effectiveness. By late 1944, most of the original Nomonhan veterans were gone. The unit's kill rate dropped. Its loss rate increased. Meanwhile, the 9th Fighter Squadron, the Knights, maintained operational effectiveness throughout the war. Pilots rotated home after completing their tours. New pilots arrived, were trained in the squadron's tactics, and integrated into the team. When a 9th Squadron pilot went home, his experience went with him, but his tactics stayed with the squadron. The new pilots learned the same principles: stay with your wingman, maintain formation integrity, fight as a team. The squadron as an institution was more important than any individual pilot. The same pattern repeated across all of V Fighter Command. The 49th Fighter Group, the 475th Satan's Angels, the 80th Headhunters, all maintained consistent effectiveness because they were built on systems, not individuals. The Japanese, meanwhile, were losing irreplaceable talent. When a Japanese ace died, his experience died with him. New pilots arriving in theater were increasingly poorly trained. By 1944, new Japanese pilots might have only 100 hours of flight time total. Some had less. American pilots arriving in 1944 had 300 hours of flight time and extensive gunnery training. More importantly, they arrived at squadrons with experienced instructors who could teach them the tactics that worked. The kill ratios tell the story. In 1942, the ratio was roughly 2-1 in favor of the Japanese. By 1944, it was 21 or higher. This wasn't because American aircraft were 20 times better than Japanese aircraft. The P-38, while excellent, wasn't that superior to the Ki-43 Oscar or the A-6M0. The difference was tactics, training, systems, teamwork. Individual Japanese pilots in 1945 might still be skilled, but they were operating in a system that had collapsed. They had no radar warning, no effective ground control, no coordinated formations, just individual pilots thrown into battles against coordinated American formations that operated like well-oiled machines. The samurai spirit, no matter how fierce, couldn't overcome systematic superiority. Post-war, United States. After the war ended, American military analysts conducted extensive studies of air combat tactics. They interviewed surviving pilots, reviewed gun camera footage, and analyzed battle reports. The conclusions were unanimous: teamwork won the air war. One analyst wrote, "The most successful pilots were not necessarily the most skilled individual aviators. They were the pilots who worked best within their formations, who protected their wingmen, and who prioritized mission success over personal glory." Another study found that 80 of pilots shot down never saw their attacker. They were killed by an enemy they didn't know was there, usually because they'd lost their wingman or strayed from formation. The survivors almost universally credited teamwork with saving their lives. Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Johnson, who finished the war with 22 confirmed kills, never spoke of his victories in terms of personal skill. He spoke about his squadron, about the knights, about the men who'd flown on his wing and covered his tail. "I survived because my wingmen were good," he said in a post-war interview. "And they survived because I tried to be good for them. That's all there is to it." Major Richard Bong, the top American ace with 40 confirmed victories, learned the lesson too. After McGura's death, after seeing what happened when you violated the teamwork principles, Bong became more disciplined about formation flying. In his last months of combat before being sent home in December 1944, Bong flew almost exclusively with trusted wingmen. He stayed in formation. He communicated. He followed the rules. And he survived. McGuire didn't. He died violating the principles Head taught others. It was tragic. It was ironic. But it reinforced the lesson. In modern air combat, you live or die as a team. The lesson carried forward into the jet age. Korean War pilots flew in pairs and four-ship formations using tactics refined from World War II experience. Vietnam War pilots did the same. Gulf War pilots did the same. Gulf War pilots did the same. Gulf War pilots. Afghanistan. Iraq. Modern fighter pilots still fly in pairs. They still practice mutual support. They still prioritize wingman discipline above individual glory. The technology has changed. F-35s are light years beyond P-38s. But the fundamental principle remains: teamwork beats individual skill. Epilogue, August 2, 1943. 12:16 p.m. Lieutenant Colonel Hachio Yokoyama, veteran of Nomonhan, national hero master of aerial combat, leads his Oscars into battle. He expects a dogfight. He expects the Americans to scatter to engage in individual duels where his superior experience and skill will decide the outcome. He expects to win. Instead, he encounters something his training never prepared him for. The P-38s turn into his attack. They don't scatter. They don't run. They turn toward the threat, and they do it together. Yokoyama lines up on one P-38 confident he can outmaneuver it in a turning fight. Then another P-38 appears from the side, guns blazing, forcing him to break off. He tries again. Same result. Every time he lines up a target, another American appears to ruin his attack. It's not fair. It's not honorable. It's not the way warriors are supposed to fight. But it works. Within minutes, Yokoyama is dead. His squadron commander Kashima is dead. Multiple veteran pilots are dead or falling toward the sea in damaged aircraft. The Americans return to base intact. All of them. Every single pilot. This is the moment. Right here in this 10-minute battle over an unnamed stretch of water, when the outcome of the Pacific Air War becomes inevitable. Not because the Americans have better planes. Not because they have more resources. Not because they're more skilled individually, but because they've learned to fight as a team. The Japanese aces expected a dogfight. Individual pilot against individual pilot, skill against skill, warrior against warrior. The Americans delivered a system. And the system was invincible. Japanese pilots never expected American B-17 crews to keep flying after losing half their tail. But most of all, they never expected their fighter pilots to refuse the challenge of single combat. The samurai spirit met the industrial machine. Individual honor met systematic efficiency. The lone wolf met the pack. And the pack won. Not because wolves are weak individually, but because a coordinated pack of wolves will always defeat a stronger animal that fights alone. The lesson was written in the sky above the Yuan Gulf on August 2, 1943. It was written in the burning wreckage of Oscars falling into the sea. It was written in the survival of every American pilot who made it home that day. Teamwork beats skill. System beats spirit. Coordination beats courage. The Japanese aces expected a dogfight. They got a war. And in modern war, the team always wins. August 2, 1943, 12:15 p.m. Yuan Gulf, New Guinea. Gerald Johnson's P-38. Lightning sliced through tropical air at 5,000 feet, the twin Allison engines purring with that distinctive muffled roar. Below him, the coast of New Guinea stretched like a green scar between ocean and sky. Columns of black smoke rose from Japanese positions as B-25 strafers worked over the shoreline, their cannons and machine guns tearing apart anything that moved. Johnson led the 9th Fighter Squadron, the Knights, and right now his job was simple: keep those Mitchell bombers alive. The radio crackled. Captive Red. This is Captive Blue. Wally Jordan's voice. Johnson's eyes swept the sky above him. Nothing but blue and scattered clouds. Go ahead, Blue. I've got movement. High. 11 o'clock. Johnson's stomach tightened. He squinted through the plexiglass, searching. Then he saw them. 12 dots. Maybe more. Materializing from the glare like ghosts. And they were diving. Bandits, Johnson called. 11 o'clock high. Everybody prep for combat. His gloved hand hit the external tank release. Nothing happened. The two 165-gallon drop tanks hanging beneath his wings refused to budge. Around him, other Knights had the same problem. Feverishly, pilots worked the release mechanisms, while the Japanese fighters grew larger with each passing second. The setup was textbook perfect. For the Japanese. The Knights were low and slow, barely making 250 miles per hour at their economical cruise setting. Their external tanks. still attached, added drag and weight that turned their P-38s into sluggish pigs, and the Japanese were 5,000 feet above them, diving down with all the advantages of altitude position and surprise. In air combat, altitude equals energy. Energy equals speed. Speed equals life. The Japanese had all three. The Americans had none. Johnson's mind raced through the mathematics of aerial combat. The enemy fighters would hit them at nearly 400 miles per hour. His P-38s laden with external tanks would be struggling to accelerate. The Japanese could dive through, pick their targets, and zoom back up before the Americans could even react. This was how P-38s died. Through his windscreen, Johnson could see the lead Japanese fighter now. Sleek, graceful. A Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar with its distinctive inline cockpit and elegant lines. Behind it, more Oscars stacked in pairs descending like falcons on wounded prey. "Stay together," Johnson barked into his radio. "Turn into them. Get your guns up." The Knights banked hard left, climbing desperately into the attack. Johnson felt his P-38 shudder as he pulled back on the yoke, the twin booms groaning under the G-forces. His external tanks finally broke free, tumbling away like silver fish. But others weren't so lucky. Grover Fanning's voice crackled over the radio. "Tanks want release. Tanks want... Stay with your leader." Johnson cut him off. "Fanning, stay on Wally's wing." The Japanese formation was close enough now that Johnson could see the muzzle flashes. Orange flowers blooming in the tropical sky. Tracers. Red on the Japanese side, green on the American. Laced between the two formations like deadly ribbons. This was it. The collision. Speed versus coordination. Individual skill versus team discipline. The Japanese expected a dogfight, the kind of swirling acrobatic combat that had made them legends over Russia, China, and the Dutch East Indies. They were about to discover that the Americans had learned to fight a different kind of war. The two formations merged in a fury of fire and metal. 4 years earlier. Summer 1939. Mongolia-Manchuria border. Lieutenant Colonel Hachio Yokoyama pulled his Nakajima Ki-27 fighter into a vertical climb, the Mongolian steppe falling away beneath him. 2,000 feet below, a Soviet 116 fighter burned on the grassland, black smoke, marking Yokoyama's 23rd kill of the summer. He was 36 years old. A veteran. A professional soldier who'd joined the Imperial Japanese Army in 1931 and spent the next 8 years perfecting the art of aerial combat. Now commanding the 64th Fighter Sentai in this forgotten border war, he was proving that Japanese pilots were the finest in the world. The war had started over a boundary dispute. The Soviets claimed one line, the Japanese another. What began as skirmishes between cavalry patrols had exploded into a full-scale conflict involving tens of thousands of troops, hundreds of tanks, and the largest aerial battles the world had seen since the Great War. And the Japanese Army Air Force pilots were dominating. Warrant Officer Hiromichi Shinohara of the 11th Sentai would finish the summer with 58 confirmed victories, the highest score of any pilot in the conflict. Others weren't far behind. Captain Kenji Shimada claimed 45. Sergeant Major Satoru Ono got 34. The list went on. They flew the Ki-27, a fixed-gear fighter that looked like a relic but could outturn anything the Soviets threw at it. Light, agile, responsive. In the hands of an expert, it was a weapon of surgical precision. The tactics were simple individual skill, aggressive maneuvering, and the samurai spirit of Bushido. A Japanese pilot didn't fly in rigid formations. He was an artist, a warrior. He trusted his eyes, his reflexes, and his courage. When Soviet fighters appeared, Japanese pilots would peel off individually, or in loose pairs engaging in freewheeling dogfights that spread across miles of sky. Tight turns, sudden chandelles, climbing turns that reverse direction, snap rolls, split S, dives, every maneuver designed to get guns on target while evading enemy fire. And it worked. The Japanese claimed over 1,000 Soviet aircraft destroyed during the summer of 1939. Whether the actual number was that high remains debated by historians, but there's no question the Japanese had the upper hand in the air. Yokoyama himself became a national hero. Shot down and wounded, he evaded capture behind Soviet lines and made his way back to Japanese territory. The newspapers praised his courage. His exploits were taught to new pilot cadets. He was everything a Japanese fighter pilot should be. But the Nomonhan incident taught another lesson, one that most Japanese pilots never learned. 2 pilots from Yokoyama's brigade went down behind Soviet lines during the fighting. The army assumed they'd died in combat. Memorial services were held. The men were enshrined at Yasukuni, the sacred shrine where Japan's war dead were honored. The press called them gods of war. Then in the fall of 1939 they came home. The Soviets had captured them and released them after the ceasefire. The 2 pilots returned expecting gratitude celebration, perhaps medals for their sacrifice. Instead, the army confined them to quarters. A secret military court convened. The verdict was predetermined. Within days, coffins appeared outside their doors. Pistols lay inside. The message was clear. Better to die than surrender. Better to take your own life than endure the shame of capture. Both men accepted their fate. They picked up the pistols, placed the barrels in their mouths, and pulled the triggers. The other pilots in the brigade received the message, loud and clear. Fight to the last breath. Never surrender. Individual honor above all else. This was the culture that shaped Lieutenant Colonel Hachio Yokoyama and the men of the 24th Sentai when they arrived in New Guinea in May 1943. They were legends. Veterans. Men who'd proven themselves against Russian aces and survived the most brutal air combat of the pre-war era. They flew the new Ki-43-2 Oscar, an improved version of the planes they'd flown at Nomonhan, faster, better armed, but just as agile. They expected to face the Americans the same way they'd faced the Russians, individual pilot against individual pilot, skill against skill, warrior against warrior. They were wrong. August 2nd, 1943, 12:16 p.m. Huon Gulf. The mission had seemed routine when Lieutenant Colonel Yokoyama led his fighters off the runway at Wewak that morning. Escort duty. Lieutenant General Hatazo Adachi, the senior Japanese Army commander in the Southwest Pacific, was flying to Leh for an inspection. Given what had happened to Admiral Yamamoto 3 months earlier, shot down and killed by American P-38s, the Army wasn't taking chances. Yokoyama brought his best men. First Lieutenant Makosuke Kashima, his top squadron commander, and a skilled ace. 24 veteran pilots, many of them Nomonhan survivors. Triple aces had shot down Russians, British, Dutch, and Chinese aircraft. The Oscars stacked themselves around Adachi's transport in layers. Some flew at 500 feet just above the wave tops. Others climbed to 5,000 feet, forming a protective umbrella. The transport itself, a fixed landing gear reconnaissance plane from the 1930s, hugged the coast at barely 300 feet, hoping to avoid detection. They'd almost made it to Leh when the B-25 strafers appeared. The Mitchell bombers came in low and fast, their nose-mounted cannons and machine guns ripping apart Japanese positions along the coast. Above them, P-38s orbited in protective layers, the 9th Fighter Squadron providing top cover. The two forces spotted each other at almost the same instant. Adachi's pilot yanked his transport into a hard turn and dove for the wave-top's engines, screaming. The general's only chance was to get away from all those P-38s and make a run for the nearest airfield, Meanwhile, Yokoyama's high cover, the Oscars at 5,000 feet, found themselves in a tactical nightmare. Gerald Johnson's Knights were climbing toward them from below. Wally Jordan's flight was swinging in from the right. Both American formations were between the Japanese fighters and their escape route. Yokoyama did what every fighter pilot at Nomonhan had done: he attacked. The Oscars rolled inverted and split SD down toward the Americans. Some went after captive Red Flight. Others dove on captive Blue. The formation split apart, each pilot picking his target, trusting his individual skill to carry him through. It was exactly what their training and experience told them to do. But Gerald Johnson's Knights didn't scatter. They didn't break formation and engage in individual duels. They turned into the attack as a unit. Wally Jordan saw the Oscar diving on him from behind and to the right. His external tanks were still attached. He couldn't accelerate, couldn't dive away. In a dogfight, he'd be dead in seconds. But Wally Jordan wasn't alone. Grover Fanning, flying as Wally's wingman, saw the threat. His tanks hadn't released either. His P-38 felt sluggish, heavy, unresponsive. Every instinct told him to punch away from the fight, get his tanks off, come back when he could maneuver. But the Knights were built on teamwork. The most inviolable law in the 9th Fighter Squadron: never abandon your element, leader. Fanning yanked his P-38 into a hard right turn. The aircraft shuddered. Speed bled off. The external tanks created drag that made the Lightning handle like a brick. But it was enough. Fanning's nose came around. The Oscar filled his windscreen. So close he could see the pilot's leather helmet, the red roundels on the wings. His finger closed on the trigger. The P-38's nose-mounted weapons erupted. 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon, all converging on a single point. Every 6th round from the 50s was a tracer, green streaks that marked the path of death. The Oscar's canopy exploded in a shower of plexiglass. Fanning's cannon shells tore through the fuselage near the cockpit. Sparks flew. Pieces of aluminum skin peeled away. The graceful fighter rolled over, flames streaming from the engine, and fell toward the Huon Gulf. Wally Jordan's life had been saved. Not by his own skill, not by superior aircraft performance, but by a wingman who'd put the team above himself. And Wally Jordan returned the favor. The Oscar had been tracking. The one head turned toward in that desperate climbing turn was right in front of him now. Wally pulled the trigger. His gun spoke. The Oscar pilot, apparently expecting the P-38 to run, had no time to react. The fighter exploded and spun wildly downward. 2 Oscars destroyed in less than 30 seconds. Not because the American pilots were more skilled, not because their aircraft were better in a turning fight, because they'd fought as a team. All across the sky above the Huon Gulf, the pattern repeated. The 2 Johnsons, Gerald and Stanley, no relation, and Jump O'Neill, reacted to the Japanese bounce by turning into the attackers and putting their guns on them immediately. O'Neill's tanks refused to release too, but he stayed with Gerald and Stanley through the initial climbing head-on pass. 2 more Oscars, wreathed in flames, spun past the Americans on either side. Victims of coordinated, concentrated firepower, the Japanese pilots, masters of individual combat, found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to break apart. Every time they lined up on a P-38, another Lightning appeared to ruin their attack. Every time they tried to engage in a turning dogfight, the Americans extended away, zoom climbed back to altitude, and came back for another coordinated pass. The battle lasted maybe 10 minutes. When it was over, the statistics told the story. The 9th Fighter Squadron claimed 11 enemy aircraft destroyed without a single loss. Lieutenant Colonel Hachio Yokoyama, national hero and legend of Nomonhan, was dead. First Lieutenant Makosuke Kashima, ace and squadron commander, was dead. The 24th Sentai, one of the most decorated and experienced fighter units in the Japanese Army Air Force, had been gutted, all to protect one general in an obsolete transport plane. General Adachi survived. His plane made it to Cape Gloucester, then continued to Rabaul, where he reported by radio that he was safe. But the cost to keep him alive had been devastating. After the main battle ended, something remarkable happened. One Oscar pilot refused to run. With Yokoyama dead, Kashima dead, and the escort mission in shambles, this lone pilot could have dove for the deck and fled. The P-38s were faster in level flight. He couldn't escape by running. But he didn't run. Instead, he stayed and fought. One Ki-43 Oscar against the entire 9th Fighter Squadron. The Americans attacked him repeatedly. Pass after pass, P-38s dove on the lone Oscar, guns blazing. And pass after pass, the Japanese pilot evaded them. He refused to go head-to-head with the Lightnings. Had learned, probably the hard way, about the devastating firepower of a P-38's nose-mounted weapons. A 50 caliber machine gun fired 800 rounds per minute. The P-38 had 4 of them, plus a 20mm cannon that fired high explosive shells. When all 5 weapons converged, they could tear a fighter apart in seconds. So the Oscar pilot dodged, juked, took snapshots when he could. He used every trick Had learned at Nomonhan and in the years since. When a P-38 came diving in, Had pull into a sudden steep chandelle, a climbing turn that reversed his direction. The P-38 diving at high speed couldn't follow. It would flash past, and for a split second the Oscar pilot would have a deflection shot. His bullets rarely hit, but they forced the P-38 pilot to break off, to extend away, to reset for another attack. Then another Lightning would come in. And another. The Oscar pilot whipped his fighter around in impossibly tight turns, trying to get his guns on the slashing P-38s after they sped by. The Ki-43 didn't have the speed to run away. All the pilot could do was keep fighting, turn, dodge, snap, shoot, until he either died or the Americans gave up. Eventually the Americans gave up. Low on fuel and ammunition, the Knights let the Japanese pilot go and turned for home. It was an epic one versus many dogfight that ended in a draw. Exactly who that lone pilot was will never be known with certainty. But intelligence analysts later speculated it might have been Warrant Officer Chiyoji Saito, a veteran ace with over 20 kills to his credit. Whoever he was, he exemplified everything the Japanese Army Air Force valued: individual skill, courage, and the refusal to surrender, even against impossible odds. It was magnificent. It was also irrelevant. Because while that one pilot was demonstrating supreme individual skill, his unit was being annihilated. The 24th Sentai straggled back to Wewak that afternoon with massive losses. The ground crews waited anxiously for hours, hoping more planes would return. Toward dusk, they gave up. The unit sank into despair. Their commanding officer was gone. Their best squadron commander was gone. Some of the most experienced pilots in the entire Japanese Army Air Force were gone. All because they'd fought the American way as individuals. No. They'd fought the wrong way. They'd fought the way aces had fought in 1916 and 1917 during the Great War. And just like the aces of 1916 and 1917 during the Great War. And just like the aces of 1916 and 1917 during the Great War. And just like the aces of 1916 and 1917 during the Great War. And just like the aces of 1916 and 1917 during the Great War. And just like the aces of 1916 and 1917 during the Great War. And just like the aces of 1916 and 1917 during the Great War. And just like the aces of in the early years of the Great War, fighter pilots were lone wolves. Individual heroes who flew alone, or in loose formations seeking out enemy aircraft for personal duels. Their names became legendary: Manfred von Richthofen, Georges Guynemer, Albert Ball, Eddie Rickenbacker. But by 1917, most of them were dead. Richthofen, the Red Baron himself, fell to ground fire in 1918, but only after years of fighting had proven that lone wolves had short lifespans. Guynemer disappeared in 1917. Ball died the same year. The survivors learned. By late 1917 and into 1918, the successful fighter pilots weren't the ones who flew alone, seeking individual glory. They were the ones who'd learned to fight in coordinated teams. The lesson was simple. In modern aerial combat, teamwork beats individual skill. But lessons written in blood fade quickly from memory. By the time World War II began, many air forces had forgotten. They had to learn the lesson all over again. The Japanese Army Air Force never fully learned it at all. The U.S. Navy learned it at Midway in June 1942. Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thack led a flight of F-4F Wildcats against Japanese Zeros during the battle. The Wildcat was outclassed in every measure of performance. The Zero could outturn it, outclimb it, and outmaneuver it. In a traditional dogfight, the Wildcat pilots should have been slaughtered. But Thack had developed a tactic he called the Thack Weave. Two pairs of Wildcats would fly parallel to each other, separated by several hundred yards. When Zeros attacked one pair, that pair would turn toward the other. The attacking Zeros, focused on their targets, would suddenly find themselves flying directly into the guns of the other pair of Wildcats. Then the pairs would cross and weave back the other direction, back and forth, weaving like a snake. Every gun covered every position. Any attack on one pair exposed the attacker to the other pair. The formation moved as a single entity. Slow perhaps, but incredibly difficult to attack. At Midway, Thack and his wingmen used the Thack Weave to survive waves of Zero attacks. Thack himself scored 3 kills despite being heavily outnumbered. More importantly, he and his pilots survived. The tactic spread throughout the Navy. By late 1942, every Navy fighter pilot knew the Thack Weave. It had been drilled into them, as one pilot later recalled. The trick was to fly as slow as possible and weave left and right, back and forth, with the other flights performing the same maneuver at staggered altitudes. Every pilot had someone covering his six at all times. The Army Air Force in the Pacific learned its own version of the lesson. In early 1942, American pilots in P-40s and P-39s tried to dogfight with Zeros and Oscars. They got slaughtered. The Japanese fighters were more maneuverable, could turn tighter, and could climb faster at low altitudes. So the Americans adapted. They developed tactics that played to their strengths and avoided their weaknesses. Speed and altitude became everything. American fighters would climb high, higher than the Japanese typically patrolled. Then they'd dive down and slashing attacks, fire a burst, and zoom climb back to altitude before the Japanese fighters could react. Never turn with a Zero. Never try to dogfight an Oscar. Use speed. Use altitude. Use teamwork. And above all, never ever abandon your wingman. By late 1943, these principles had been codified into formal doctrine. Major Tommy McGuire, one of the leading aces in the Pacific, wrote a tactical manual that was distributed to every pilot arriving in the Southwest Pacific area. The manual's core principle was simple: teamwork, the integrity of the formations, and fighting together. It was, as one historian later wrote, the hallmark of McGuire's tactical manual. When pilots violated this principle, when they broke formation to chase individual kills, McGuire would be furious. Even Dick Bong, the top American ace of the war, once broke formation to chase a bomber, and McGuire seethed over the breach. The Americans had learned what the Japanese never did. In modern aerial combat, the team is more important than the individual. The battle on August 2, 1943, demonstrated the American system in perfect action. When the Japanese Oscars dove down from above, they expected the P-38s to scatter. They expected individual dogfights where superior Japanese maneuverability and experience would decide the outcome. Instead, they encountered a wall. Gerald Johnson kept his element together. He and his wingman Stanley Johnson turned into the attacking Oscars and put their guns on them immediately. Neither man tried to peel off for individual combat. They fought as a unit. When an Oscar rolled in on Gerald from behind, Stanley saw it and called it out. When Stanley's tail needed clearing, Gerald was there, back and forth covering each other, watching each other's 6 o'clock position. 2 Oscars, wreathed in flames, spun past them on either side, victims of coordinated fire. Wally Jordan and Grover Fanning demonstrated the same principle. When Fanning's external tanks wouldn't release, he could have broken away from the fight. His P-38 loaded down with drag and weight was a sitting duck. But he stayed with Wally. And when an Oscar dove on Wally from behind, Fanning turned into it, tanks and all, and shot it down. The Oscar pilot focused on Wally never saw Fanning coming. By the time he realized another P-38 was in firing position, it was too late. Fanning's guns tore him apart. Wally in turn used the moment Fanning bought him to destroy his own target. Neither man would have survived alone. Together, they were unstoppable. Jump O'Neill flew the same way. His tanks wouldn't release either, but when Gerald and Stanley turned into the Japanese attack, O'Neill stayed with them. 3 P-38s weaving and covering each other, putting up an interlocking stream of fire that no Japanese pilot could penetrate. This wasn't luck. This wasn't accident. This was the result of months of training and indoctrination. Every pilot in the 9th Fighter Squadron had been taught, your wingman's life depends on you. Your life depends on your wingman. The formation is sacred. Individual glory is meaningless if the team dies. The results spoke for themselves. 11 Japanese aircraft destroyed. 0 American losses. The 9th Squadron returned to base intact, all pilots accounted for. 1 P-38 aborted with hydraulic failure and crashed on landing, but the pilot walked away unhurt. Meanwhile, the 24th Sentai, one of the most experienced fighter units in the Japanese Army Air Force, had been gutted. Yokoyama dead. Kashima dead. Multiple veteran pilots gone. The unit would never fully recover. It wasn't because the Americans had built a system that turned average pilots into a deadly team. And in the skies over the Pacific in 1943, the team always beat the individual. February 10, 1944. Taji Airdrome, New Guinea. Dick Bong eased his P-38J Lightning into a gentle turn, his eyes scanning the sky. 15,000 feet below the Japanese airfield at Taji lay like a scar on the jungle. A few scattered buildings. A single dirt runway. And Bong's eyes narrowed. Aircraft. Tommy, you see them? Bong's voice crackled over the radio. Roger. Tom Lynch flew as Bong's wingman today, his silver P-38 holding position 300 yards to Bong's right. Count 6 fighters taking off. And a twin-engine job going the other direction.